Today, we're going to talk to Natasha Lennard about her book, Being Numerous, Essays on Non-Fascist Life.
So thanks again for having accepted my invitation, and it's my pleasure talking to you. I have, as usual, a kind of brief introductory note about you. And so Natasha Lennard is a columnist for The Intercept. Her work has appeared in The Nation, Book Forum, and The New York Times, among others. She teaches critical journalism at the New School of Social Research in New York. She's the author of Being Numerous, Essays on Non-Fascist Life, but also edited an interesting collection of essays, Violence, Humans in Dark Times with Brad Evans. So Natasha, obsessed, bewildered by the shipwreck of the singular, you have chosen the meaning of being numerous. Why being numerous?
So yeah, these the lines you just beautifully cited, they're from a poem by George Oppen, late great poet, who wrote a poem named Of Being Numerous, from where those lines come. And I read it years and years ago, and it always really struck me as sort of applicable in so many iterations of how we think about how we become organized socially and politically, and how we live kind of interdependently among each other. So yeah, this idea of we have chosen the meaning of being numerous seemed really applicable when we think about the ways that, as we are produced as data through Silicon Valley corporations. And this is like a one given way of how we live, and our enumerated numerosity, which maybe isn't particularly liberating, but then you might think of, amassing in the streets, as happened last year in the US in the 2020 uprisings for Black liberation. That's a kind of really bold and liberatory form of numerosity and being numerous in different ways. And I think all the more we've realized during the coronavirus pandemic how very unavoidably numerous and interdependent we are, in both kind of in ways that are indeed perilous, if not reckoned and reoriented from how they currently are. It's really notable, whom capital leaves to die or not. So I just sort of was very struck by Oppen's ruminations on what it means to choose the meaning of being numerous and how we might choose it differently. So it seemed like a good title. And
right. But aside from that, I mean, it's also, the title goes like Essays on Non-Fascist Life. And it is my second question, let's say, that we know the appearance of the phrase non-fascist in the context of the work of Gilles Deleuze and Michel Foucault, written in the aftermath of May 68. Yet you have not, at least in the title of the book, used the term anti-fascist. You've used non-fascist. On the other hand, according to Deleuze and Guattari, is quoting them, it's too easy to be anti-fascist on the molar level and not even see the fascist inside of you, end of quote. And I guess different chapters of your book have one thing in common, and it is loving power in molar and molecular level. I use one sort of impersonal experience in Germany, where I live. A lot has been done, as we all know, to hinder and prevent such molar fascism. Yet I have the impression that fascism in everyday life, the way people talk to you, correct you constantly, make you feel like justifying yourself as a non-white, bearing the stigmatic name Muhammad, walk on the street or meeting strangers, the way people stare at you, etc., has not been taken seriously that much as a ways desire work. People are careful here and cautious of molar fascism, like not being racist or sexist or not discriminating against you on the surface, but it seems that it's more of a moral obligation with legal consequences. Sorry for being that. I mean, that question is a bit long. As a consequence, I think that my problem in most of my expectations is that Antifa, at least here, as general and unfair as my idea might sound, has been regarded as a purely molar and conscious act, and not in the realm of desire. To what extent do you think that, I mean, your take of fascism, non-fascism, and anti-fascism in general addresses the question of micro-fascism?
Right. So yeah, as you know, I use the term non-fascism for a number of reasons. Certainly to nod towards the Deleuzian and Foucauldian sense of talking about micro-fascisms, the micro-fascisms that undergird daily life under capitalism, those kind of hierarchies and systems of power of which we become are desirous, find ourselves becoming desirous, and serve all kinds of continuous oppressive purposes, which felt really important in a book written, you know, slap bang, or kind of compiled slap bang in the Trump presidency, because there was a huge amount of discussion around a kind of fascistic project, in the sense of, will there be a regime of fascism brought into the US? Will fascism come back? And in a framework wherein fascism was only understood as something, you know, birthed in the 20th century Europe that has been destroyed by the great championing of liberal democracy, and that there's this risk it could come back, which, you know, stands counter to so much excellent theorizing, including by Deleuze and Guattari, that you know, that we've always had a continuity of modernity and fascism through these kind of micro-fascistic dynamics and desiring patterns, and you know, the shift from molecular to molar fascism would be completely baffling to anyone who refused to pay attention to the micro-fascisms and how they order so much of life, and unequally so. Another way it seems relevant to bring up a kind of non-fascist reference in order to just kind of disrupt the assumption that I'm only talking about Antifa types of anti-fascism, is that in the US particularly, the anti-fascist project has never needed to have a kind of new dictatorial, formally authoritarian regime. There has always been forms of fascism in the organization of the US state, as it is based on both coloniality, population extermination, and slavery. And it was actually the Black Panther Party who made it with their Rainbow Coalition, that was kind of multiracial radical coalition, made a point of having anti-fascism as a hinge concept, and not shying away from talking about the fascism in the US carceral system, the fascism in the US police state, and not needing some figure of Trump to come in and be this fascist. So I think there's this kind of long history of talking about the continuities of micro to macro fascisms that I wanted to point to, whilst giving a nod to Foucault, whilst also hoping that if someone picks up the book, they're not just going to be like, oh, this is a book about Antifa, because it's not just, like, I mention Antifa and tactics, right, and Antifa strategies, but you know, that's a particular European lineage, and only one form of you know, anti-fascist strategizing that names itself as such.
I mean, when we talk about concepts such as like discipline, such as power, I mean, we can sort of follow Deleuze writing about Foucault, and like use terms like, okay, the shift from disciplinary societies to control societies. To what extent do you think, Natasha, that, I mean, when talking about fascism, we can also make such a distinction between disciplinary societies and controlled societies?
I think we can, but I think there has been, and this is actually quite an interesting, this debate, if we can call it a debate, has actually kind of emerged quite importantly, and challenged a lot of, I think, of people's presumptions about how they think of biopower and disciplinary society around the pandemic, because you have thinkers like Agamben, who's like, you know, a theologian who Right now, if you're reading his work, you think he's off his rocker, because it's this inability to distinguish the kind of, oppressive productions of biopolitical order and organization and governance, and those sort of techniques of governance from, the much more, this idea that, we do need to perhaps rethink of a kind of non-oppressive form of biopolitics or biopower and life management that reckons and does justice to our mutual interdependence. And I think a lot of the 68 post-68 thoughts sort of never reckoned with that. And that's probably because it was not an accident that it was incredibly white and incredibly male. And so I think the concept introduced to kind of counter that by Akili Mbembe, who talks instead about necropolitics and the idea that, we kind of miss a trick if we're just talking about a move from a kind of sovereign ordering over life and death to disciplinary management over life. It's not surprising that an anti-colonial theorist is like, hey, hang on a second, this is actually about, we can't ignore that the ordering of capital keeps so many people in bare life and, a kind of living death of proximity to death and disposability. So I think if we just stick with a kind of Foucauldian beady eye looking out for forms of biopolitical power and being like, no, not that, we could fall into Agamben's trap of being like, seeing a concentration camp everywhere where it isn't.
Right.
So I think there's a risk in that I don't even think Foucault necessarily introduced. I think it's how it's been kind of expanded and misused. Like, I think an archival history of biopolitics doesn't necessarily mean we're not able to say like, okay, this was this appalling ordering and enumerating of people in the world and their lives. But like, how do we think differently about life management towards flourishing and liberation without being just so nervous of talking seriously that, we have global problems that have to have an internationalist response that might, have a certain biopolitical element, that, them being pandemics and climate decimation.
Right. I have another long question asking for your patience. The relation between fascism and even anti-fascism and violence is quite blurred and tricky. In an interview you have it that, quoting you, I mean, rather, there is a certain impossibility to invoke a sense of non-violence when we are talking about confronting organized fascism. When protests involve physical fights or property damage, the media has a tendency to state that event turned violent. This applies as much to Black Lives Matter protests, indigenous struggles against pipelines, or any other movement, end of quote. How do you make a distinction between violence and fascism? People, like in Iran, people go on a street and protest against a petroleum price, hijab, or electricity cut, and they are immediately accused of violence. Although we know that this is nonetheless a response to pre-existing violence at the scene. I guess such questions obligate us to have a broader understanding of violence. I'm looking forward to reading Brad Evans' History of Violence, as I see that one reason we have problems maintaining a non-fascist life is that our understanding of violence is mainly a legislative and molar one generally produced by the state. Don't you think that having more comprehensive understanding of violence can help us track the gradual violence of the state and resist the accusation of being violent by simply mobilizing people on the street? For me, one instance of violence, which is a little abstract in everyday Iranian lifestyle, and aside from the corruption inside the system, is the violence of sanctions. I'm reading an interesting book by Nicholas Mulder called The Economic Weapon: The Rise of Sanctions as a Tool of Modern War. I mean, I'm really convinced that our understanding of violence is very narrow.
No, it very much is. And it very much, it only locates itself. Well, there's a kind of a number of things. Either it locates itself just at the kind of the point of a physical blow in a street, like an actual physical altercation. But then, you know, obviously, as soon as you expand from that, you see that, you know, what we're dealing with is who has the authority to determine what violence is or isn't. So, you know, according to the state, a Black teenage boy holding a toy gun is not only seen and transmogrified by white supremacist policing as a potentially violent object, when a policeman kills him and then is, you know, not, if prosecuted at all, but, you know, not convicted because the courts judge, oh no, it was reasonable to see this child as a threat, that violence, that transmogrification of, you know, life into violent threat becomes formalized at like every level of the state, both like frontline policing and the juridical decision-making and law. So yes, and then you move on to things like you mentioned, economic violences, and that could be in the form of sanctions, which are in their nature, they're eliminationist, right? They're like, we will make lives unlivable. And then, you know, there are all sorts of enacting of like the removal of sufficient funds for food or housing, the, you know, evictions are violent.
Or medicine now, I mean, like.
Exactly, like any, you know, any sort of systems that, by virtue of the authority to do so, grant themselves the power to push people into kind of, yeah, that maintain that necropolitical power to push people to a proximity to death or indeed death. The European Union is so deeply violent in letting thousands and thousands of migrating people die in the Mediterranean Ocean, and then still will call itself a kind of non-fascist collaboration of nation states. I mean, it's wild. So then, you know, that, like that, you know, that just requires a broader understanding of what violence is. And I think it's absolutely necessary. I can get a little pessimistic about whether it's going to happen, because, you know, Martin Luther King wrote a letter from Birmingham jail, you know, half a century ago, complaining about the white moderate who was more committed to order than justice. And it's that same, you know, that same white moderate, that centrist liberal who is a conservative essentially, will say, you know, no, I support Black Lives Matter. I support, you know, I even support, you know, indigenous struggle against pipeline projects, but I just wish they weren't so violent. Like I would support them, but not for their strategies because they're not orderly. And then, you know, these are the very same people who I'm sure would say, I like Martin Luther King's philosophy, but they're the very people Martin Luther King would have called, you know, as much of a barrier to Black liberation and all people's liberation as, you know, self-identifying white supremacists and Klan members. So, you know, the idea that if we just kept saying, can't you see the structural violences? Can't you see the structural violences of racial capitalism everywhere, and borders as a violence, as, you know, necessitating the violence for their own maintenance? Do I suddenly think like lots of people will be like, ah, yes. Because and so that it's, which is just to add a depressing note. But yeah, the point I make in the book that you noted is that it's particularly tiresome when people talk about protests turning violent, when if you have the police indiscriminately killing Black people, if you have, you know, white supremacists marching and taking power, as, you know, Republican fascists are all around state houses in the US, when you have, you know, people chanting Jews will not replace us in the streets, like this is a state of background, the background state is violence. So you can't turn to violence. And, you know, asking people who are, I put in the book that there is a kind of meta violence to asking people whose lives are so ordered by violence and who cannot turn from violence because of how they are oppressed by the state and by capital, to then say, why can't you be peaceful? To ask peace of people who literally are not allowed to have it in their lives is, you know, an extraordinary insult, I think.
So I mean, I use this opportunity to use the question of affects in the project of Non-Fascist Life. Let's say, something which is at least nominally or formally common in both anti-fascism and fascism is this common affect. Let's say, to me, one significant impetus in resisting fascism is anger, even the rage which has been accumulated as a result of various forms of oppression. Yet there are, I suppose, other modes of resistance which are underexploited. And again, to me, one significant leverage to resistance, to resisting power without being perverted by it, is humor. And again, I have the impression that this has been much overlooked, even in the progressive politics of the left. It's no wonder to me that in the introduction to Anti-Oedipus, Foucault says, quoting him, the traps of Anti-Oedipus are those of humor. So many invitations to let oneself be put out, to take one's leave of the text and slam the door shut. The book often leads one to believe it is all fun and games when something essentially is taking place, something of extreme seriousness, the tracking down of all varieties of fascism, from the enormous ones that surround and crush us to the petty ones that constitute the tyrannical bitterness of our everyday lives. End of quote. I believe it's partly rooted in Foucault's inspiration from the likes of Pierre Hadot, the French philosopher, which I suppose, again, due to distancing from the Stoic philosophy among left critics, has been utterly stamped out and ignored. What do you think of other modes of, or let's say other affects in resisting fascism?
Yeah, no, I think it's really, really interesting. And I think humor, like, just to riff on what you're saying, it's like, you do see a lot of generative, powerful, like potent humor on the left, and not just in Twitter. I mean, Marx was hilarious for one. But if you're in a kind of massive, like a lot of the kind of taunting and chants and camaraderie around, just to name a few instances, like the Black Lives Matter uprisings last summer 2020, the kind of playfulness with fireworks and, taunting signs and irony, and taking irony seriously and not just letting it be, as it often functions as some sort of like, cover for the far right to be incredibly racist. I mean, the far right is very good at using irony, and covering their tracks with irony. And it's not something I think we should cede to them. And I think it's difficult to have much purchase on it in this current kind of historical moment, because so much of what counted for humor of the left was not at all confrontational. It was Jon Stewart and The Daily Show sort of saying, it's enough that we laugh along at how much of a clown George Bush is. And that puts you on the right side of history. And it's this deeply unconfrontational liberal humor, that I think kind of took over too much of the sphere, and that kind of made the left sort of want to move more towards a self-serious and aggressive affect. But I think, you spend enough time in organizing circles and street protests, and there is an abundance of humor. And I think the other very, very crucial, it's not necessarily affect production, because it's more of a sort of mode of social relating, is kind of care and nurture and feeding each other. And we saw a lot of that in mutual aid organizing throughout the pandemic, and understanding that we need to be, as mutually sustaining as possible. The risk of that, of course, is sometimes it ends up just being a sort of band-aid for where, larger forces fail so many people. So it's like, don't worry, we'll do mutual aid, we'll look after ourselves, we keep us safe. You don't want that to be a kind of a cover for capitalism, being like, no, look, see, everyone's actually okay because they're looking after themselves. It's not sustainable in that way. But I think that kind of nourishment and mutual care, mutual aid is so crucial. I think what has been overplayed in the left, since the 60s and onwards, and is being kind of challenged, interestingly, now more and more, but this idea of, like that that sex and romance are so deeply important to radical leftist project. And like, no doubt, you know, one cannot have liberation without having also being liberated to make the sexual choices you want, and to make the partnership choices or non-partnership choices and modes of living choices that you want mutually, and to challenge the predetermined desires that we might have had encoded through the lives we've lived under capitalism, etc., and patriarchy, etc., and racism, etc. But by the same token, I think there was, and this has also been written about a lot, that happened a lot in Germany, you know, through thinkers like Wilhelm Reich, who I do reference in the book and who I think is deeply important, and Cecil Waite, that these are really, really important thinkers and make a really good intervention about desire, but definitely overplay and over pathologize to a point that almost lets Germany off the hook too much in terms of a kind of broader materialism, to be like, oh, you know, if they'd been fucking right, there would have been no Nazis. And I think then the kind of inheritors of that is this kind of, you know, the free love movement and some of the more kind of faux liberatory sex positive communities you see now, that actually almost imagine you can fuck your way into a revolution, and you can't. You know, it no doubt shifts in our material conditions and our ability to flourish and live and you know, undo oppressions may likely indeed lead to changes in how we desire and more liberated desires coming through. But you can't put the horse before the cart. You can't be like, oh, if I just like shag everything everywhere, but you know, ethically, then suddenly we'll have this kind of we will necessarily have this revolutionary emergence. And yeah, so I think that's a sort of weird hangover from the 60s that we still see, that overly focuses on certain types of sexual affect and intimacies that are actually often very unintimate. I'm not saying don't do whatever you want, obviously do whatever you want ethically and you know, consensually and respectfully, but yeah, I think I just think there's just been too much focus on radical sex, to be honest.
I've also this quote from Yasmin Nair, that quoting her, the sad truth that many of us learn after years in sexual playing fields is that how many people you fuck has nothing to do with the extent to which you fuck up capitalism.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and like her essay from where I quote that is too dismissive of like the importance of you know, sex, the politics of sex. I think she is too dismissive there, but I agree with that quote. And I think particularly what we do fail to notice in when we kind of put certain things like sexual intimacy at the forefront of our political organizing, which is not to say against, you know, conservative movements to ban gay intimacy and ban trans life. Like that should be at the forefront of our politics, and needs to be. But at the same time, you know, we don't want to end up making other people in our other comrades, other members of just other people in general, part of our like neoliberal project of self-actualization toward a more like, you know, radical libidinous desiring format. Like, you know, that is the risk of being like, oh no, we must desire this way. I have a desiring desire to desire this way. You know, that risks treating other people as part of this, which would be a neoliberal and liberal project of self-actualization, and not particularly interdependent and mutually caring. And I think you do see that, and that's not taken into account, and you know, does fall into a type of individualism whilst pretending not to.
Well, you have specified one whole chapter on desiring and policing desire, I suppose, yeah, like policing desire. And there I quote you, by treating sex as a political project, rupturing preconditioned desires, might we end up reducing each other to experimental objects for our own self-development? You don't answer this question, but your position is clear, that talking about the queer privilege, quoting a fact theory writer, that there is still a bigoted white world out there full of enforced normativity, compulsory heterosexuality, and relentless violent policing, where a generalized ideology of anti-normativity holds sway. Queerness is a badge of honor, a marker of specialness, and a source of critical and moral authority. In short, a form of privilege. And to be honest, it's something that I really feel a lot in Berlin among in these like liberatory sexual movements, like a new privilege that has been offered, I would say. So
which isn't necessarily bad. It's just how, you know, it's how, and it's, you know, but it is often racist. But
how, like, racist?
Oh no, I think a lot of, well, maybe like just, you know, not necessarily, it's not a necessary relation of racism to have queer privilege. Just a lot of queer liberatory spaces in Berlin are really racist. Like Berghein's really racist. Like, it's really fun, but it's like the door policy is really racist. But you can fuck in a dark room. Do you know what I mean? It's like, whose liberation?
Right. There is one chapter that I really liked is like ghost stories. You say that, quoting you, is a political imperative to believe impossibly that another world is possible, while necessarily being unable to explain that world from the confines of this, from this one. Quoting Maggie Nelson, that the inexpressible contained inexpressible is in the express. What do you exactly mean by that?
I mean, what I think I mean, as I think many people who are on the left have experienced in their lives, you often get asked, like, well, what do you propose instead? And, you know, once you move beyond the basics of, you know, equality, when you're talking about, I want the end to capitalism, I want the end to the bordered nation state, and people demand of you, well, what do you propose instead? How exactly is that going to look? And it's genuinely impossible to answer, because we are so constricted by the ontologies we have received in this current moment, and the hierarchies that are so entrenched they literally become ontology. You know, especially when it comes to you know, the organization of the nation state, which is not even that old, but seems so entrenched that people cannot truly think beyond it. But we know that there is a moral imperative to project beyond it and to work towards that which we cannot necessarily articulate its futural form. Which isn't to say, you know, just throw spaghetti against the wall and see what happens, but to recognize that the kind of process of struggle is not one that kind of has necessary clear articulated formation of the utopia it aims to produce. That's why, like, people talk about utopian horizons, not already formulated better horizons. And, you know, that's the difference between a you know, a more kind of parliamentary only focused social democrat, democratic socialist model to a kind of more radical communist one, I think. And yeah, and you know, the lines in my ghost essay, which is my favorite in the book, actually, because it's fun. It's fun. Some things should be fun. And it's from Wittgenstein, but Wittgenstein in his earlier work concluded, whereof one cannot speak, pass over in silence, thought he had finished philosophy, but then obviously in his far more interesting, I think, later work, went on to you know, actually manage inner philosophy of the everyday, of the words we do use, and understanding, you know, meaning in the form of what we mean is exposed in how we use language, and that is a dynamic thing, and that meaning is dynamic based on use. And I think, you know, that Wittgenstein didn't actively apply that to political, you know, spell casting. But if we understand meaning as in use, but we haven't put into use because of the hierarchical systems of the capitalist nation state, we haven't put into use a kind of communism we might want to see, in a kind of mutual flourishing and liberation we might want to see. Those meanings have to be produced in use, but they're kind of impossible. But somewhat impossible to delineate in advance, even if we kind of know where to push towards.
Another interesting part of the book was where you talk about outside agitators. There are points in the book that I can really sympathize and connect with from at least 3 angles: the American, the European, and the Iranian. And they can be amazing. They apply to all 3 territories. For instance, where you talk about outside agitators, it can be equally applied to all these territories of power: in the US through blacks, for example, in Germany through refugees, and in Iran basically through the young people in the streets. But another commonality of all these territories is where you say that, quoting you, we can better appreciate American fascism in a way that make clear in no uncertain terms that fascism in this country was not undone by the unseating of Trump, nor is it simply a question of battling far-right organizations and individuals, end of quote. What is, I mean, let's say it's my last question. What is your take on the unseating of Trump now in the US? Now we have Biden and the things are apparently changing. I don't know, what's your take on it? I mean, when it comes to fascism or non-fascism?
So yes, Trump is no longer president, and that is a good thing. It is to, you know, there is, you know, kind of an anarcho-insurrectionary radical tendency to be like, a president's a president, it doesn't matter. Like Joe Biden is you know, war hawk, imperialist, you know, racist, and all of those things are true. But it doesn't mean that it is not better to have a President Biden than a President Trump. It just it is, and you know, we've already the major infrastructure package that is going to be passed, and then a kind of more expansive one pushed through a very specific format in American policymaking that doesn't require the Republicans, will be significant, but obviously far too small and obviously insufficient. Obviously, we still have, you know, an appallingly violent border, mass incarceration, unfettered police violence. I mean, the police are violent, but their violence remains as unfettered as ever. You know, capitalism unchallenged. You know, you see small shifts that maybe in the Obama years towards social welfare that, you know, Biden has taken up, thanks only, of course, and as ever, to leftist organizing and pressure. The decision to shutter the Keystone Pipeline, that was good, but that was not a Biden alone decision, right? That is a response to profound indigenous-led struggle. But no, and then in terms of the kind of, so we've got the kind of structures of racial capitalism, which are robust in micro-fascisms and quite formal fascistic institutions like the vast American prison state, and policing and the border. And then, but in terms of and then all the micro-fascisms of racial capitalism as ever, and patriarchal capitalism. But then in terms of the far right, they are by no means gone with with the unseating of Trump, and not even just in a parliamentary sense. A lot of state houses around, you know, a lot of state houses that are non-federal are Republican majorities with QAnon supporters as representatives of government. We've seen an unprecedented and vile number of anti-trans laws sweeping states from Arkansas to Texas. I think there's about over 50 anti-trans laws, largely aimed at children. And anyone who knows the kind of history of gender and sex policing and how it intersects with colonial practices, which and the sort of racialized and gendering patterns, which are the kind of undergirding structures of fascism, colonialism brought home, should be very, very attuned to these anti-trans campaigns, efforts as fascist, and truly in need of stopping with all the force we can muster. And I obviously have no time in the world for people who call themselves feminists, but don't support trans lives. So the far right is strong and it is bad. But Trump is not president, and that is good. So this is my advanced analysis. Bad, good.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm really grateful to the time and effort you made.